Before the leaks and whistleblowers, certain images remained buried in classified archives for decades, hidden from public view and investigative scrutiny through systematic classification. These 40 photographs reveal what authorities worked to keep hidden from public view through classification and restricted access policies designed to prevent disclosure. Blurred surveillance equipment fills an embassy room photographed in 1963 during routine maintenance operations when a contractor breached security protocol and captured images before security personnel intervened to confiscate the camera and demand return of all film and negatives. The image shows sophisticated acoustic monitoring devices installed behind walls throughout multiple diplomatic conference spaces used for sensitive meetings. Equipment later confirmed operational during sensitive international negotiations throughout the Cold War era, involving delegations from numerous foreign governments, conducting bilateral and multilateral discussions on strategic matters. The concealed devices recorded conversations in 12 separate rooms across 3 floors of the building for intelligence analysis, their existence completely unknown to visiting diplomats and foreign officials for nearly 2 decades of continuous operation without detection or disclosure. Technical analysis revealed the system was capable of monitoring simultaneous conversations and transmitting recordings to remote locations for analysis by intelligence personnel assigned to diplomatic intelligence gathering operations. Aerial crater from weapons test captured in 1952 reveals actual blast radius far exceeding official reports and technical specifications submitted to congressional oversight committees specifically tasked with monitoring nuclear weapons development programs and ensuring public safety standards were maintained according to regulations. The massive detonation occurred in desert terrain, specifically selected for its perceived remoteness from any civilian populations and urban development areas. Yet the photograph surfaced decades later, clearly contradicting public safety assurances repeatedly given to nearby communities located within 50 kilometers of the designated test site perimeter established by program administrators responsible for safety protocols. Comprehensive measurement analysis conducted years after the initial detonation revealed actual blast effects and fallout patterns extended 40% beyond the officially reported danger range documented in initial assessments submitted to government oversight bodies. Radioactive fallout detected in previously declared safe zones prompted eventual compensation programs for affected residents who developed serious health problems, including various cancers linked to radiation exposure from atmospheric testing. Underground bunker interior with supplies photographed in 1971 shows extensive stockpiles of food, water, medical provisions, communication equipment, and survival equipment intended exclusively for select government officials and their immediate families during potential national emergencies or catastrophic events threatening national security and government continuity. The extensive facility contained sufficient provisions to sustain 200 designated individuals across 18 months of complete isolation from outside contact while maintaining command and control capabilities, while comparable public shelters in surrounding residential areas received minimal government funding and woefully inadequate supplies for emergency preparedness, despite public assurances of civil defense readiness programs. The stark disparity between elite and public preparations was exposed when maintenance workers' camera was immediately confiscated by armed security personnel responding to security breach. But developed photographic negatives had already been carefully removed from facility premises and survived in private possession for decades before eventual public disclosure through investigative journalism that exposed the 2-tier emergency preparedness system. The revelation sparked public outcry over inequitable resource allocation during Cold War civil defense planning that prioritized government continuity over civilian protection despite official rhetoric, emphasizing comprehensive population protection programs and civil defense preparedness. Failed rocket launch explosion moment captured in 1967 documents catastrophic structural malfunction that scattered burning debris, unexploded ordnance, and highly toxic propellant chemicals across multiple inhabited areas located downrange from the primary launch facility during what was supposed to be routine test flight. Official statements released to media outlets within hours of the incident claimed successful controlled demolition of malfunctioning vehicle following standard safety protocols and procedures established for such emergencies. While this photograph taken by experienced range observer clearly proves uncontrolled fragmentation pattern and debris dispersal that directly endangered civilian zones within 3 kilometers of the launch site's established perimeter fence, designed to protect populated areas. Specialized debris recovery teams located scattered wreckage fragments in residential neighborhoods and agricultural areas for 6 weeks following the incident, with some pieces containing hazardous materials requiring special handling and disposal procedures to prevent environmental contamination or public exposure. Medical experiment facility exterior photographed in 1959 appears as ordinary research building with standard institutional architecture typical of the era and indistinguishable from legitimate medical research facilities, yet secretly housed controversial psychological and pharmaceutical studies conducted without proper informed consent procedures from enrolled human participants who believed they were receiving standard medical care or participating in beneficial therapeutic programs. The unremarkable structure stood operational for 40 years before scheduled demolition in 1999 following program termination and facility consolidation. With extensive facility records indicating approximately 600 human subjects enrolled under deliberately false pretenses regarding actual study purposes and potential health risks between 1955 and 1973, when program oversight finally improved following regulatory reforms. Investigators later determined many participants were systematically recruited from vulnerable populations, including institutionalized individuals, economically disadvantaged communities, and those lacking access to independent medical advice or legal representation to protect their interests and ensure truly informed consent to research participation involving experimental treatments and unapproved pharmaceutical compounds. Chemical waste being dumped into water, photographed in 1965, shows thick industrial effluent containing heavy metals, toxic organic compounds, and dangerous chemical byproducts discharged directly from processing plant drainage pipes into public waterway actively used for municipal water supply systems and popular recreational purposes by communities located downstream from the facility operations throughout the watershed. The documented improper disposal practice continued completely uninterrupted for 12 years, despite multiple detailed internal memoranda from company scientists and safety personnel explicitly acknowledging contamination levels consistently exceeded all established federal safety thresholds by factors of 40 or more, creating serious health hazards for downstream populations relying on the waterway. The incriminating photograph was eventually leaked by long-serving facility engineer facing terminal illness, who made the difficult choice to disclose damning evidence after decades of enforced silence under corporate pressure and confidentiality agreements designed to prevent whistleblowing. Comprehensive testing of riverbed sediment samples taken from the affected area decades later still showed significantly elevated contamination levels requiring ongoing environmental monitoring and remediation efforts to protect public health and aquatic ecosystems. Indigenous families being relocated, photographed in 1973, documents forced mass displacement of entire established communities from ancestral territories to enable large-scale resource extraction projects planned by corporate interests operating with explicit government support and legal protection from liability claims or environmental restrictions. The disturbing image shows 75 families, including young children and elderly members, loaded onto military transport trucks, with only minimal personal possessions allowed per household under strict limits, enforced by security personnel overseeing the relocation operations. Government records eventually obtained through protracted legal proceedings and freedom of information requests filed by advocacy organizations revealed designated relocation sites completely lacked promised infrastructure for adequate housing construction, clean water access systems, or basic sanitation facilities for the first 3 years following forced displacement from traditional lands, creating humanitarian crisis for displaced communities that received minimal support. Despite government assurances of adequate resettlement assistance and infrastructure development at new locations designated for permanent settlement. Aircraft wreckage near residential area photographed in 1961 after experimental military vehicle crashed during unauthorized low-altitude testing flight conducted directly over populated zones in clear violation of all established safety protocols and restricted airspace regulations designed to protect civilian populations. Burning debris and large wreckage components landed within 200 meters of occupied residential homes containing families, fortunately causing no direct casualties despite the extremely dangerous proximity to civilian populations and potential for catastrophic loss of life. The official accident investigation report systematically omitted all specific proximity details and geographic information identifying affected neighborhoods, then classified the entire incident documentation package for 50 years, citing national security concerns, effectively preventing affected residents from accessing any information about potential exposure to hazardous materials, toxic substances, or long-term health risks from fuel and composite materials. Detention facility cell block interior photographed in the 1950s reveals severely overcrowded and inhumane conditions, housing political detainees held indefinitely without formal criminal charges, legal representation, or meaningful access to judicial review of their detention circumstances or grounds for confinement. The cramped cell blocks held approximately 300 individuals in confined spaces, originally designed and approved for maximum capacity of only 80 persons under normal conditions, with minimal sanitation facilities shared among 50 people per functional unit, creating severe health and hygiene concerns throughout facility. The revealing image was smuggled out by transferred guard, who personally witnessed the deteriorating conditions for 2 years before successfully obtaining transfer to different facility and choosing to preserve photographic evidence of conditions despite personal risk to career and potential criminal prosecution for unauthorized disclosure of classified facility operations. Environmental disaster spill site photographed in 1969 captures immediate aftermath of major pipeline rupture, releasing over 200,000 gallons of petroleum products mixed with chemical additives into protected wetland ecosystem, supporting diverse wildlife populations and endangered species habitats, critical to regional biodiversity. Professional hazardous materials response teams arrived 18 hours after initial catastrophic breach occurred. Despite sophisticated automated monitoring systems detecting catastrophic pressure loss and triggering multiple redundant alarms within minutes of the rupture event that should have prompted immediate response. The photograph was taken by concerned local resident who accessed the rapidly spreading contamination area before security perimeter was fully established and public access completely restricted by company security and local authorities coordinating response efforts. Secret listening post construction photographed in 1964 shows installation of sophisticated electronic surveillance infrastructure deliberately disguised as routine telecommunications equipment, maintenance, and standard transmission tower upgrades to avoid public scrutiny or questions from local communities. The covert listening post successfully intercepted domestic communications without judicial warrants or legal authorization for 25 years before its actual existence was finally confirmed after persistent investigative journalists obtained original construction permits and blueprints through repeated freedom of information requests spanning 7 years, despite numerous bureaucratic access denials and document classification claims. The powerful facility effectively monitored all communications within 30-kilometer radius of its strategic location, collecting data on thousands of citizens without their knowledge. Psychological experiment laboratory photographed in 1958 documents specialized research facility where controversial sensory deprivation tanks, coercive behavioral modification techniques, and aggressive interrogation methods were systematically tested on unwilling human subjects without any independent oversight or ethical review procedures. The laboratory operated continuously until forced closure in 1975 under protective cover of ostensibly legitimate therapeutic research programs funded through government grants. With this image representing one of only 3 known photographs surviving systematic destruction of all photographic evidence specifically ordered during emergency facility closure procedures implemented when congressional investigation threatened exposure. All participating researchers were required to surrender complete documentation and photography upon abrupt program termination under threat of security violations. Biological weapons facility aftermath photographed in 1966 shows extensively contaminated laboratory space following serious containment system breach that directly exposed 40 facility workers to experimental pathogens during active research phases involving dangerous biological agents designed for potential weaponization. The serious incident occurred during unauthorized accelerated testing schedule, implemented to meet artificially compressed program deadlines imposed by program administrators, while subsequent internal investigation findings were completely suppressed and immediately classified at highest levels to prevent public disclosure. All affected workers received ongoing medical monitoring without full disclosure of specific exposure risks they faced or potential long-term health consequences from pathogen exposure during containment failure. Illegal weapons transaction photograph captured in 1972 documents direct transfer of restricted military weapons systems to unauthorized foreign parties through established intermediary networks operating across international borders to circumvent export controls. The image clearly shows multiple crated weapons systems and ammunition pallets at established transfer point during nighttime loading operations, with congressional investigators years later confirming the documented transaction violated multiple binding international arms control agreements and numerous domestic regulations controlling weapons exports to foreign entities without proper authorization. The unauthorized transfers continued for 2 years before discovery. Destroyed historical artifacts photographed in 1960 reveals deliberate demolition of significant archaeological sites containing irreplaceable artifacts and ancient structures to enable commercial construction projects prioritized over cultural preservation and historical conservation by development authorities. The destroyed artifacts and architectural remains were scientifically dated to approximately 800 years prior to demolition through carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis. Yet large-scale destruction proceeded rapidly, despite sustained objections from established preservation societies, museum directors, and academic institutions specifically requesting temporary delay for proper archaeological documentation and artifact recovery. The photograph was preserved by dedicated site archaeologists who risked career consequences documenting destruction against explicit orders from project supervisors and government officials overseeing the development. Nuclear facility disguised as farm photographed in 1968 shows innocuous above-ground agricultural structures deliberately masking extensive underground enrichment operations, concealed from international weapons inspectors and monitoring agencies conducting routine verification visits. The facility successfully processed weapons-grade nuclear material for 15 years while maintaining elaborate agricultural cover, including fully functional farming operations, producing actual crops, and maintaining livestock herds that provided completely legitimate explanation for facility activities and regular supply deliveries. The facility's true purpose was disclosed only after independent satellite imagery analysis from intelligence sources using advanced photo reconnaissance technology directly contradicted official government declarations and international reporting requirements. Military strike smoke rising over buildings photographed in 1970 during combat operation conducted against civilian infrastructure targets, including critical water treatment and electrical distribution systems. Action officially justified through classified intelligence assessments, later determined by independent review to contain fundamentally unreliable information from compromised sources with questionable credibility. The photographed strike completely destroyed primary water treatment facility serving estimated 50,000 residents in surrounding metropolitan area, creating immediate humanitarian crisis requiring emergency water distribution. While this damning evidence photograph directly contradicted official public statements released to domestic and international media, claiming only legitimate military targets were engaged during the carefully planned operation. Surveillance van monitoring citizens photographed in 1962 shows specially equipped mobile unit deployed for extensive domestic intelligence gathering operations, conducted without any judicial oversight, court authorization, or standard warrant procedures required for lawful surveillance under constitutional protections. The clandestine program operated simultaneously in 12 major cities across multiple states, collecting detailed communications data, personal information, and movement patterns on approximately 10,000 targeted individuals over a 5-year period from 1960 to 1965. Finally exposed when comprehensive vehicle maintenance records, operational logs, and surveillance reports leaked through compromised administrative channels when disgruntled program participant provided documentation to investigative journalists. Radiation testing site with warning signs photographed in 1965 documents extensively contaminated area resulting from repeated weapons development activities and nuclear materials testing yet left completely accessible to general public and grazing local livestock for 8 years following initial contamination events that spread radioactive materials across wide area. The warning signs clearly visible in photograph were erected only after multiple mysterious livestock deaths prompted independent soil and water testing by concerned university researchers using portable radiation detection equipment, while official government assessments prepared by program scientists had systematically downplayed actual contamination severity levels and health risks by factors of 20 or more to avoid public concern and potential legal liability. Offshore detention facility exterior, photographed in 1971, reveals purpose-built structure deliberately positioned to circumvent domestic legal protections and constitutional safeguards by holding detained individuals outside recognized territorial jurisdiction and beyond effective reach of civil courts and legal aid organizations. The isolated facility held approximately 150 individuals without meaningful access to legal counsel, family contact, or communication with outside world for extended periods, spanning months or years, its very existence officially denied in repeated public statements and government testimony until independent satellite images obtained through intelligence sources conclusively verified its precise geographic location and confirmed its operational purpose as detention center. Scientific Research Lab with documents photographed in 1969 shows classified long-term studies systematically examining health effects of industrial chemical exposure conducted by secretly tracking exposed workers over multiple decades without providing informed disclosure of study participation, health risks, or monitoring procedures. The comprehensive research program followed approximately 2,000 employees across 30 years of continuous monitoring and data collection, with systematic research continuing uninterrupted despite early preliminary results clearly indicating significantly elevated disease rates, cancer diagnoses, and mortality among exposed populations compared to control groups. The incriminating photograph was obtained during mandatory facility records audit conducted by regulatory inspectors. Mind control experiment room photographed in 1963 captures specialized chamber used for psychological manipulation research involving extreme sensory alteration, prolonged sleep deprivation, and pharmaceutical intervention, administered to subjects without their knowledge or informed consent. The controversial program operated across 8 separate government facilities in different regions for 12 years from 1961 to 1973 before exposure through congressional investigation prompted immediate termination and facility closures. With this revealing image surviving strict document destruction protocols and evidence elimination procedures implemented during emergency closure operations, specifically designed to eliminate all photographic and documentary evidence of program activities. Industrial accident toxic cloud, photographed in 1967, shows massive emissions plume from serious facility malfunction that exposed surrounding residential areas to hazardous chemical compounds, requiring eventual evacuation of affected zones. Evacuation orders were critically delayed 6 hours, while company legal team assessed potential liability exposure and consulted with corporate executives, resulting in approximately 800 people receiving significant chemical exposure, requiring ongoing medical monitoring, health assessments, and treatment for subsequent 40 years. The damning photograph was taken by emergency responder who arrived during initial response phase before company security restricted access to contaminated area. Bulldozers destroying farmland, photographed in 1959, documents large-scale land seizure for military installation expansion, conducted with compensation well below established assessed market value and without meaningful appeal process for affected landowners facing displacement. The action permanently displaced 45 farming families who had worked the productive agricultural land for 3 consecutive generations, with all legal challenges systematically dismissed on national security grounds, despite subsequent independent analysis, showing minimal strategic value of acquired territory for military purposes. Many displaced families received compensation insufficient to purchase comparable replacement property. Training exercise casualty scene photographed in 1968 reveals serious accident during military training drill using live ammunition conducted in dangerous proximity to civilian populations without adequate prior notification or safety precautions for nearby residents. The incident resulted in 3 confirmed deaths and 12 serious injuries among residents living near designated exercise zone. While official inquiry classified all findings and sealed all survivor testimony for 30 years, preventing public disclosure or accountability. Families of victims were required to sign non-disclosure agreements to receive compensation. Wiretapping equipment installation photographed in 1964 documents domestic surveillance infrastructure deployed without legal authorization, specifically targeting journalists, political activists, and civil rights leaders. The extensive program monitored approximately 500 individuals through sophisticated phone line intercepts and concealed room audio devices, with this photograph leaked by installation technician, who objected to program scope expanding far beyond stated counterintelligence objectives to include domestic political monitoring. The program operated for 8 years before exposure. Institutional medical facility photographed in 1961 shows conditions at psychiatric hospital, where involuntary patients were subjected to experimental treatments without adequate oversight or appeal mechanisms. The facility operated for 35 years, housing approximately 600 individuals, with many committed through administrative procedures that bypassed judicial review, finally exposed through patient testimony after policy reforms enabled comprehensive release reviews. Some patients had been institutionalized for decades based on minimal evidence. Secret diplomatic meeting photograph captured in 1970 reveals unauthorized negotiations conducted outside official diplomatic channels, directly contradicting public policy statements made to domestic audiences and international partners. The meeting involved transfer of military technology in exchange for resource access rights, its occurrence officially denied by government spokespeople until photographic evidence surfaced through intelligence leak during subsequent administration. The unauthorized diplomacy violated established protocols. Nuclear waste disposal into river, photographed in 1966, shows liquid radioactive material discharged from processing facility directly into waterway, supplying 100,000 downstream residents with drinking water. The practice occurred weekly for 5 years, despite internal safety assessments, warning of accumulating contamination in river sediments. Photograph taken by facility contractor, facing retaliation for raising concerns through proper channels. Downstream cancer rates increased significantly in following decades. Banned weapons system prototype photographed in 1962 documents development of munitions prohibited under international treaties signed 4 years prior to development initiation. The program continued until 1968 under budget allocations disguised as defensive research. Prototype testing conducted at remote site revealed through procurement records obtained by investigative reporters. Development violated treaty obligations ratified by legislature. Medical quarantine camp gates photographed in 1965 shows facility where individuals detained based on health status without due process or appeal options available to challenge detention. The camp held 200 people in isolation for periods exceeding medical necessity. Conditions included inadequate sanitation and limited medical care despite stated public health rationale. Image smuggled out by visiting clergy member who witnessed conditions. Many detainees were held for months beyond infectious period. Military vehicles in neutral territory photographed in 1969 captures incursion, violating international agreements, establishing buffer zones between contested regions for peacekeeping purposes. The deployment involved 300 personnel and armored equipment, positioned for 6 weeks before withdrawal following diplomatic pressure from international community. Official statements claimed navigational error despite photographic evidence of established encampment with supply lines and defensive positions. The incursion violated ceasefire agreements. Defective equipment inspection report photographed in 1963 reveals internal testing documents showing critical safety failures in systems already deployed to operational units serving in active duty. The defects caused 12 accidents, resulting in 8 fatalities before equipment recall. Manufacturer and procurement officials suppressed test results for 18 months, while contract negotiations proceeded. Document leaked by quality control inspector. The suppressed information prevented safety modifications. Financial transaction document photograph captured in 1967 shows fund transfers to unauthorized accounts, diverting resources intended for public infrastructure projects to private interests. The scheme involved $40 million in misallocated funds across 4 years, discovered during routine audit. Subsequent investigation classified to protect institutional relationships, despite evidence of systematic fraud involving multiple officials. The diverted funds were never fully recovered. Accidental Weapons Release Recovery Team photographed in 1968 documents response to munitions deployment system malfunction that dropped ordnance in unintended location 90 kilometers from designated target zone during training exercise. Recovery operations required evacuating 600 residents, while retrieval teams secured unexploded devices. Incident classified and omitted from operational records despite substantial civilian risk created. Several devices remained unrecovered for weeks. Prison Pharmaceutical Testing Facility photographed in 1966 reveals program using incarcerated individuals as test subjects for drug safety trials without meaningful consent or compensation for participation. The program operated in 8 institutions enrolling 200 prisoners in studies for commercial pharmaceutical development. Practice continued until 1975 when legal challenges established informed consent requirements for research involving imprisoned populations. Some participants suffered permanent health consequences. Aerial spraying operation over farmland, photographed in 1970, captures chemical dispersal program conducted without notification to landowners or residents in spray zones affected by operations. The operation covered 50,000 acres over 3 months, testing defoliant effectiveness. Resulting crops showed contamination requiring destruction, while health effects among exposed populations monitored without disclosure of exposure to experimental chemicals. Livestock in affected areas also showed adverse health effects. Interrogation facility training room photographed in 1965 documents instruction space where techniques later deemed torture were developed and practiced on training subjects. The program trained 400 personnel in methods including sensory deprivation, stress positions, and psychological manipulation. Facility operated under intelligence training designation until investigative reporting revealed curriculum content violated international humanitarian standards. Techniques were used in overseas operations. Environmental impact study documents photographed in 1973 show assessments predicting substantial ecological damage from planned industrial project that proceeded despite findings recommending cancellation. The studies indicated wetland destruction affecting 10,000 acres and species habitat loss. Documents suppressed during approval process and disclosed only through legal discovery in subsequent litigation brought by conservation groups. The predicted environmental damage largely occurred as assessed. Secret prison construction site photographed in 1960 reveals facility built to house political detainees outside normal criminal justice system, without charges or trials. The prison held 250 individuals without formal charges or trial procedures for extended periods. Its existence officially denied for 15 years until released prisoner testimony corroborated by this construction photograph confirmed the facility's location and purpose. Many prisoners were held for years without legal representation or family contact.